It's official. I have prayed and tested and tried, and I've finally come up with a poison build that is just absolutely broken once you have it fully maxed out. This build is the best of both worlds poison build, and you can swap between overall insane poison damage such as 10, 15, 20 million poison ticks of damage per second and use that absolutely perfectly, and then swap over to the Barber Heart in case you want to just speed run through earlier content. For speed leveling, you can use both of these on this build, which is very fun and gives us a lot of flexibility to play however we want. Now, even though I'm only level 91, I'm able to run tier 80 and 90 dungeons without too much of a hassle, and soon I should be pushing tier 100 nightmare dungeons with a hybrid build that can not only do 10 or 20 million poison tick damage per second, but who can also use the Barber and essentially speed run dungeons and blow up every enemy around you. And this endgame build with just a couple tweaks can also defeat Uber Lilith extremely quickly, almost quicker than every other class in the game. And one of the reasons I'm able to level so quickly with this build is because of how great my PC runs, which is why Jawa is today's sponsor of this video. But hear me out, Jawa is one of the best sellers of PC parts, in my opinion, on the internet today. Jawa's mission is to be the community where gaming gear is sold at reasonable prices between gamers. Jawa's platform is extremely easy to navigate. You can jump between buying custom PCs, pre-built PCs from other people, separate GPUs, CPUs, and all of this stuff at pretty discounted prices that make building or upgrading any PC very easy. Or you can buy parts and PCs directly from verified sellers. Jawa also has a commission build program where you can commission a build and go through a quick quiz, and a verified builder will reach out to you with exactly the kind of build you want for what you describe that you need. Additionally, you can buy custom PCs already built. Jawa also has a feature where if you want to upgrade your graphics card, you can actually sell your graphics card directly on the site, or you can get a quote to essentially trade it in. If you want to skip the hassle of research, buying, and building a gaming PC for yourself, let one of Jawa's verified sellers build one for you. Visit the link in the description to check out Jawa for yourself. Thanks Jawa for sponsoring this video. Let's get right back to the build. First, I'm going to start by touching on these skills and go over them very quickly. So ideally, we're going to use Puncture. This is going to be one of our skills that generates our energy and applies vulnerable to a lot of enemies. Next, we're going to obviously go for our core skills and do Advanced Twisting Blades, and make sure you go to Improved Twisting Blades, so that way you daze enemies while they're actually impaled by the blades. Then we want to grab 3 out of 3 for Sturdy to give us that close DR. We want to grab 2 out of 3 for Siphoning Strikes just for the additional healing that we get from Lucky Hit. You can choose to put 3 points here if you want, but as of right now, I don't really need it. You then want to grab 1 out of 5 for Shadow Step into Methodical Shadow Step, so that way when you damage enemies by Shadow Step, they're actually stunned for 2 seconds, giving us an extra CC ability for our multiplicative damage. Each CC effect we have on enemies is going to greatly increase the amount of damage that we do. I'm going to take 1 out of 3 for Concussive, so that way you get increased critical strike chance for knocking back or knocking down enemies, which you'll do with Poison Trap very often. 1 out of 3 for Trick Attacks, so that way when you critically strike a dazed enemy, they're knocked down for 0.5 seconds, and Rapid Gambits, so your evade cooldown is reduced by 0.5 seconds when you daze an enemy. And then we're going to come down here for our Subterfuge skill. We're going to grab 1 out of 5 for Dark Shroud. We're going to do this simply because we're going to be using an aspect for Dark Shroud, so that way it grants us a free shadow almost every single time we get a lucky hit, and each of those gives us 8 damage reduction per shroud, and we can have up to 5 of them. This is a huge thing because we can get 40% free damage reduction and almost keep it up constantly just by having 1 point here in the aspect. So you want to make sure you have this. We don't need to spec over here because the movement speed isn't that important. We then want 1 out of 5 for Concealment. Again, no skills after that. We just want it so that way it grants us Unstoppable and the movement speed and stealth. And we're going to use this with our Decoy Trap ability. That way we actually bring a bunch of enemies in all together to be able to pile them up and run through them very quickly. Then we want 1 out of 5 for Poison Trap. We want to go into countering Poison Trap, so we have a 30% chance to reset your imbuement skill cooldown when activated. This is going to be a big one because our imbuement skill cooldown is going to give us basically the maximum amount of poison damage that we're going to be dishing out to enemies. We then want to come down here, grab 3 out of 3 for Precision Imbuement. This makes sure that our imbued skills get critical strike chance. We also then want 5 out of 5 for Poison Imbuement, and you can see I have 12 out of 5 here. I have additions on my gear that give me extra points here, which I will go over. What you can see here is your next 2 imbuable skills. Deal poison damage and apply 252% of their base damage as poison, giving us our massive amount of poison damage on enemies, and critical strikes with poison imbued skills increase that also by 75%, which is why it's also important that we critically strike on these so we get that extra poison damage. And again, that's just here taking blended poison imbuement. We then want 3 out of 3 for Debilitating Toxins, so poisoned enemies deal 15% less damage. 3 out of 3 for Deadly Venom, so you deal 9% increased poisoning damage. 1 out of 3 for Alchemical Advantage, so you get 1% increased attack speed. This can cap our bonus 15 attack speed basically every single time we get into a fight just by having 1 point here. Now ideally here what you would want to do, as many points as you can stack here is just going to greatly increase your damage overall. It's really up to you if you want to stack 3 out of 3 here or 6 out of 3 in Frigid Finesse. I just don't have the Penitent Greaves yet, because once you get your Penitent Greaves, this is going to give you additional chilled damage, and if you have the aspect for freezing enemies, this is going to give you a ton of additional damage. But it's completely up to you. So right now I don't have my Penitent Greaves and can't really do chilled damage, so I'm sticking 3 out of 3 for Deadly Venom. And then we want 1 out of 3 for Trap Mastery, so that way we increase our critical strike chance against vulnerable and crowd controlled enemies. 3 out of 3 on all of these lucky hit skills, so that way we get energy regeneration. We get 15% increased lucky hit chance here, and we also get an additional 15% increased lucky hit chance here for spending 100 in it. Regardless of your lucky hit chance, these 2 skills, once they're met, basically give you 30% free lucky hit chance. Then here we have Adrenaline Rush 1 out of 3 to get 2 haste, so that way we get that additional increased movement speed and increased attack speed. And then a lot of people here use close quarters combat. Once you get fully maxed out on your build at level 100 and get everything set up just how you want it, I do recommend switching to this because it gives us the biggest overall damage output in general. But now until you can hit tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons comfortably, Momentum gives you these pretty great bonuses for DR, for damage reduction, energy regeneration, and movement speed. And paired with our Stolen Vigor aspect, until you reach max level and min-maxed gear, this is going to keep you alive all the time. So I definitely would recommend using this until you're fully maxed out. Next, for our Specialization, we're going to be using Combo Points. Combo Points is our primary specialization, and this is just going to be because it gives us the most overall damage. Recently they kind of nerfed Inner Sight, and there's a lot of issues with it filling up your bar and actually proccing on enemies sometimes. So Combo Points right now is giving the best overall damage, especially with your core skills like Twisting Blades. This is the route to go. And now we're going to go over our gear really quickly. So ideally my gear is not perfect. I'm going to throw up the ideal stuff on the left side of the screen. I've made a lot of improvements to this build since the last speed farming video I posted to have a complete full endgame build that can actually run these tier 100 Nightmare Dungeons. So first we're going to start with our helmet. This is an aspect you can replace later once you switch over to close quarters combat at level 100 once you feel fully comfortable. But for now, for my helmet, I'm running total armor, max life, plus 4 ranks of poison imbuement, and cooldown reduction. These are the ideal skills you'll want. Now total armor is an affix you want on every piece of gear, because the more total armor you have overall, the more defense and survivability you're basically going to have. So that is a primary stat you need to make sure you have. Additionally, we're using the Stolen Vigor aspects, so that way our momentum key passive actually heals us for 319 life per second, and right now that's basically healing us for 900 life per second. That's too good to not use until you're completely comfortable switching over to close quarters combat. And then for our chest, we're using the aspect of Disobedience here, so we get that additional increased armor, and it's vital to have for our survivability. Now you can choose to put this here or on your necklace. Right now I have it on my chest. Eventually it might be easier to put it on your necklace because it is going to give you that additional armor, but for right now this is just how I'm running it. Again, here you can see we have a high roll for total armor, damage reduction overall, damage reduction from enemies that are poisoned, and max life. Ideally here, if you can get damage reduction from close or damage reduction from distant, this would also be a perfectly good or almost prioritized option over poisoned or max life in some cases. Then we're going to go with the gauntlets. So here we have 4 ranks of Twisting Blades, critical strike chance, dexterity, and lucky hit chance. Ideally you want the highest possible lucky hit chance you can get, and dexterity here you want swapped out for attack speed. And then we have the aspect of Shared Misery, so that when a lucky hit, your crowd control enemy effects actually spread to other unaffected enemies. And remember, the more crowd control effects we have on enemies, the higher overall damage we do. Next, for our legs, we have the aspect of Might. So basic skills grant 20% damage reduction for 5.5 seconds. This is a big deal because this allows us instant 20% DR every single fight at the beginning of the fight when we don't have any other DR abilities up. And here again, I'm rocking total armor, damage reduction from close, damage reduction from distant, and overall damage reduction. These are the ideal rolls you'll want for your pants. Then for our boots, we currently have movement speed because this is based on my movement speed build, but ideally here you do want Penitent Greaves. So again, you can use that additional chilled and frozen damage eventually. That's going to be best in slot here. Then for our crossbow, so here for the fixes, you want core skill damage, vulnerable damage, all stats, and dexterity. These are the perfect ideal stats you want, but because that core skill damage and vulnerable damage is going to scale very nicely with your overall poison damage, and the all stats is going to help you meet all of those extra Paragon requirements. Ideally, these are the fixes you want on your daggers, and you do want to try and run daggers if possible. So if you have these specific affixes on your daggers, you're going to be getting the best stat lines possible for your weapons for your poison rogue. Now you have 2 options. Now once you get to the full level 100 build, I recommend you actually use the accelerating aspect here. So critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by 15 to 25%. I recommend getting a max roll here of 25% and actually putting that on your crossbow, so that way you get a 50% increase boost to attack speed basically all of the time. This is going to increase our damage output by a massive amount. So I recommend that's what you do once you hit 100. This is just the way I have it, because because I'm still kind of trying to speed run. Again, all of those endgame and final changes will be in that planner below. Then for our daggers, ideally I'm still working for a dagger for this last spot, but you want the fixes I mentioned earlier. So vulnerable damage, core skill, all stats, and dexterity. And here you can see I really don't have that, and so it's really hurting my build, but I'm even able to run all of this high tier content without these stats, which is pretty crazy. So here I'm using the aspect of bursting venoms. This is going to make it so our critical strikes with poison abuse skills on lucky hit have a 10% chance to create a toxic pool, and that toxic pool is going to basically refresh our poison imbuement skill and give it no cooldown and no charge limit, so we can just spam it over and over and over, as you can see in this clip. And this is one of the things that gives us, especially with bosses and other enemies like elites, huge overall poison damage numbers that build and ramp up extremely quickly, which is actually why we prioritize lucky hit on this build, so that way we can hit these lucky hits very often and be able to spam skills like this and deal millions and tens of millions of poison damage to enemies around us very quickly. Then our other sword, we have the aspect of pestilent points. Now you can move some of these aspects around between your gear, but every third cast of puncture is poison imbued with 150% of normal potency. This is also a big one for applying a lot of poison and heavy poison onto enemies. Now let's go over the amulet and ring. The first, our amulet is 16% DR from close enemies, 3 ranks of the frigid finesse passive for extra cold damage, plus 3 ranks of all imbuement skills, and 24% damage for 4 seconds after killing an elite. For later tier content, feel free to run as much damage reduction on your amulet as possible, and that will greatly help you out. Ideally, you want the Umbrus aspect here, so critical strikes with marksman skills have up to a 75% chance, and you get up to a 90% chance to give you a free dark shroud, meaning every time you get a lucky hit, basically you're guaranteed a free dark shroud shadow and 8% damage reduction, allowing us to keep up almost constantly 40% free damage reduction from this actual aspect, or again that 1 point we took in dark shroud. And our heart here you can see is the brutal heart that actually suppresses incoming damage and explodes around us. This is going to give us decent damage and again suppress some of that actual incoming damage, and is one of the best hearts you can use for this build. Now for our ring, ideally we're going to want a couple different things. So here our primary stat you need is lucky hit chance. You need lucky hit chance, vulnerable damage, critical strike chance, and resource regeneration are the ideal 4 main stats, and if you can't get any of those 4, then maybe you want poison damage as a 5th option. I'm still working on improving them again and still running through a lot of this high tier content even without perfect stats. Again, we have the accelerating aspect on this ring, but ideally once you get to level 100 you want to put the twisting blades aspect or the blade dancers aspect from your crossbow onto your ring and swap this onto your crossbow for that extra additional attack speed. And then for our wrathful heart, we're using the additional damage over time effect, so you want that maxed out as much as possible, so that way for each crowd control effect on the target you increase your damage over time effect, so we apply all of the CC we can to enemies, and that will greatly increase our DOT damage. And additionally for bosses, they take additional damage at the bottom, you can see as well, from damage over time effects. So this is a big one to have. This is a big one to have, especially for bosses. You can see where your imbuement skill effects have 34% increased potency against vulnerable enemies. This is another thing you definitely want to make sure you have maxed out on your build in one of your ring slots, so you can take advantage of that additional increased potency we get for our poison. Now again, this is the additional ring that I like to use when I want to swap it out with the poison imbuement, just so I can kind of speed run with the barber heart. But keep in mind, if you do want, you can swap this out again for that twisting blades aspect, so you can have a perfect replica of this ring. So you can swap between this twisting blades aspect with the DOT damage wrathful heart in it, and then swap it with the exact same ring basically with the barber heart in it, so you can swap back and forth and use one for leveling and then use one for doing high tier content. And again, with Stolen Vigor on my helmet, some of these aspects could be served better places, so make sure you reference that build planner in the comments and the description, because that's going to have the overall perfect build that you want to set up. So next we'll go over the Paragon board really quickly. So the starting board, we want the versatility glyph here, so that way our non-basic and non-core skills deal 15% increased damage, giving us right off the bat a decent amount of damage for our poison abilities, greatly increasing that overall first amount of damage. We also get additional bonus to magic nodes all in these areas to greatly increase our overall all stats to help us meet requirements later, the 10% damage here and the 100 armor here. For our second board, we want to take the Cunning Stratagem board. We want to take the Diminish glyph. This is going to give us 10% reduced physical damage from vulnerable enemies, and is going to give us a lot of survivability right off the bat for initial fights. And then here for the rare node, again, this gives us also bonus to rare nodes around us, and some of these rare nodes give us 14% skill damage, which scale greatly with our poison damage, and this node for 100 armor, and a bunch of these other nodes around here, as well as this one, which gives us a ton of basic skill and core skill damage overall. Next, for our third board, we want the Cheap Shot board and the Closer glyph. This is going to give us cutthroat skill damage, and while wielding a melee weapon, you take 10% reduced damage again, so we get additional DR here, and then we get more DR from this node. And then the legendary node for cheap shot, so we get increased damage overall for each crowd controlled enemy nearby. So basically always get 25% extra damage overall. More damage here for crowd controlled. And then this rare node up here for damage to healthy enemies and armor. And again, this is overall just a great damage board. Our fourth board is the exploit weakness board. And we're going to take the control glyph here. So we deal increased damage to crowd controlled targets. And this is going to give us additional increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies and 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. So again, this works great with crowd controlled targets and enemies chilled by our penitent greaves. And then we want the rare nodes here for vulnerable damage, and the rare node here for vulnerable damage and damage to injured, and again the one over here for 4% damage reduction from vulnerable enemies and the armor. And then for our fifth board, we want the no witnesses board. This is going to be with the efficacy glyph. This is a huge and very important one because this is going to give us imbuement skill effects that have 20% increased potency, greatly affecting our overall DOT and poison damage over time. We also get the 4% max life here and some of the other max life nodes, and 10% damage from this node as well. This is a very important and quick one to grab. And then we want for our sixth board, we want tricks of the trade. And here we want to slot the devious glyph. That way when you hit an enemy with an attack that applies a crowd controlling effect, which we do all the time, they take 2% damage, up to 10% increased damage for you for 20 seconds, and it's basically a free overall 10% increase in damage overall. And then finally we have the deadly ambush board. If you can't get all of these boards completed, you might want to consider swapping this earlier out with an earlier board until you can fully get hit 100 and fill out all of these. But here we're going to slot the bane glyph. Again, this is really important because your poison damage over effects have a 10% chance to deal double the amount of poison damage, which is huge because if you deal double the amount of poison damage with some of these attacks, you could basically take your damage from 10 million a tick to 20 million a tick just from having this activated. Again, here there's another rare node for damage reduction from enemies, and these overall Paragon glyphs, I'll go over them one more time, and the numbers that the boards are supposed to be. And these are based off not only damage, but highly based off of damage reduction, total armor, and health, so that we can keep our survivability to a maximum as much as possible to again run these higher tier nightmare dungeons and run through the content fairly easily. So this is the ideal damage rotation for the poison rogue. You're going to walk around a bunch of enemies. You can then cast your concealment skill. This is going to proc our brutal heart here for our shadow decoy trap. Concealment is a subterfuge skill. Once you do that, every enemy basically is going to run to this decoy trap because that decoy trap taunts enemies. Now ideally once they start running there, you can immediately drop a poison trap. They'll all run into the poison trap and start taking poison damage automatically. They'll get knocked down and bring up a lot of your big damage multipliers. As soon as this starts happening, you can cast poison imbuement, cast it on the group, and start using twisting blades on the group. And then whether you're using the barber heart or the actual poison imbuement skill, you're going to start dealing a ton of poison damage to everyone around. And keep in mind, you can also shadow step across all of these enemies. So that way they are also all stunned, giving you another additional CC effect for your overall poison damage. Ideally here we want as many CC effects on enemies as possible. Because our overall Wrathful Heart, if we have more crowd control effects on targets, we're going to deal overall more poison damage in general. And again, we want to repeat this process with using twisting blades, spamming that, and then using puncture over and over again. And keep using our poison imbuement and our poison trap as much as possible while bringing enemies in all together with concealment. Additionally, by bringing enemies in with concealment, you can start attacking groups of enemies from a little bit behind them. So that way, while they're attacking the decoy, you can basically get a bunch of free hits without them actually really even starting to attack you. This is great because it allows us to build up our initial damage reduction skills right from the beginning. That being said, that's the overall DPS rotation. It's fairly straightforward. This build, once you hit level 100 and you max out your Paragon board completely, gives you an insane amount of overall damage. So much it's not even funny, but it is important to get to level 100 to max out the Paragon board to take full advantage of the build. That being said, hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know in the comments what your opinion on this build is and if you're level 100 already in Diablo 4. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.